Hello there, today I am here to bring you a sort of review of Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell and also discuss an issue that has sort of arisen from reading this book in a roundabout way. So those of you who have been here for a while will know that I started reading this when I went on holiday at the start of June, and I then put it to the side because I read about 350 pages while I was away, which wasn't obviously as much as I was hoping to do. I was hoping to get it finished, but I just didn't have time. So I put it to the side in the mind that I was going to come back to it in bits and pieces because it is a beast. Excuse the mess on the pages here, it is absolutely battered and bruised. It has been carried around in my bag and yeah, it's not in the best condition, although I kind of like that. I think it's quite nice for the big book like this for it to be a bit battered and clearly read. Anyway, I digress. So, I put this to the side thinking that I would just come to it in bits and pieces. It then, as a fluke, happened that I went away for 10 days in October and I managed to get it finished in that time. Now, I gave this book 3 stars and it left me quite angry. I have a distinct feeling that's partly to do with the half and half way that I read it. With me, I'm very much, I can't put a book to a side and then come back to it later on and still have the same enjoyment. I very much have to read books straight out to actually get anything from them. I think one of the main reasons I had with this was the characterisation, and from reading other people's reviews they really loved the characterisation, so it's quite possible that because I read the main parts of the characterisation, the introductions, quite a while ago, that it's just gone from my mind in reading the second half. But to me, the characters in this were quite flat. Now, this is the least of my problems with this book. They were fine, but I found that they were all quite unlikable. And there was no real depth to their unlikableness. It was just that they were kind of horrible, really. And the only character who really grasped me as pleasant was Rhett Butler, the sort of male hero, I suppose you could call him. And I found that his character was probably the least developed of all. He's kind of, I can see what Margaret Mitchell was trying to do. He's kind of the lovable rogue. But because I didn't believe in his character, his actions just kind of ended up being unrealistic. So he'd have this sort of sly smile on him no matter what the situation, and his speech was quite jolting to me. I didn't warm to him as a character, and everybody else I didn't really like. There is one character in here, Melly, who ends up being quite lovely. But other than that, they're all pretty unlikable. They all do pretty unlikable things, and they all have vile beliefs, which I just couldn't get behind. Which leads me to my other and the main point that I had that I didn't get along with this book, was that it's set in the Civil War. Now, I didn't know this going into it. I haven't seen the film. I didn't know anything about the story other than the fact that it was an epic romance. So it's set during the Civil War and it is set in the South, so it's on the side of people who don't want slavery to be abolished and they are fighting against the idea that it could be. And the language used is quite disgusting. Now, I knew this going into it, but I thought that it would be just a case of the times. I didn't realise that it was actually about people fighting against the abolition of slavery, and I would actually say that this is mismarketed because for me, anyway, the abolition of slavery and the sort of political beliefs of the people in the book were a much larger part of it than the romance itself. In fact, I didn't see any real romance in this, but we'll come to that later on. So it got me thinking about my beliefs of what authors believe and how much they put in their work. Because I found this near enough unreadable at points. The language used and the beliefs portrayed are so foul. But if I thought that Margaret Mitchell was doing that in just an observational way, it wouldn't necessarily matter because that is what people of that time believed, and it would be naive to assume that that didn't exist, that everybody was for the abolition of slavery. The issue I got was that I really felt from the language used that that was kind of the side that Margaret Mitchell was on. The other side, who are fighting for the abolition of slavery, are kind of portrayed as these monsters, and they aren't really... There's no depth to the portrayal of them. They are just portrayed as monsters. And that and other things along the way just led me to believe that this isn't just a historical book, but it's also kind of Margaret Mitchell's beliefs. At the same time, it's difficult because this was written in the 1930s. It was a historical novel at the time it was written, but even in the 1930s, things were very different and attitudes toward black people in Southern America were very different, and I understand that. But I couldn't get past it. This book even goes as far at points as to say that the slave owners and their slaves are living in happiness until the other side have come along and turned the slaves against their owners. Yet a few scenes before, one of the owners will be whipping their slave with a horsewhip to work harder. I could not let go of my own beliefs and my own attitudes to kind of get behind this. I thought it was really quite disgusting in points. So as much as I can't comment on what Margaret Mitchell believes, and I might be completely wrong, I just felt like it was kind of her putting her beliefs into a book, and they were beliefs that I didn't like. Therefore, I didn't like the book itself. Not to mention that, given that this is the great love story, and it even says on the bottom of the page there, the classic love story, there is not really any romance to speak of in this book, and it kind of baffled me. But it was the same experience I had with Wuthering Heights. When I read Wuthering Heights the first time, I struggled to see the romantic element in it. I think obviously there was a budding romance involved, but I certainly don't think that it was what you would call a great romance. And the same with this one. There is flirtations between Scarlett, our main lady, and Rhett throughout the story, but for the most part it's kind of not a healthy relationship. She spends most of the book mooning over somebody else's husband, and that whole relationship was a bit strange to me, because at first I thought he was a good guy, and then it turned out that maybe he did have feelings for Scarlett, but maybe he loved his wife, and you weren't quite sure where it stood till quite far on into the novel. And I was kind of disappointed by that, because I didn't like Scarlett. She wasn't a endearing person, she wasn't pleasant, whereas this man's wife was very lovely. It's actually Melly, who I spoke about at the start. So yeah, other than that romance, there is the budding romance between Rhett and Scarlett, but it's kind of just a teasing kind of flirtation. They don't particularly get on. It's the typical, you know, they wind each other up and they annoy each other, but there's clearly a spark between them. Nothing actually happens romantic-wise until about 800 pages in, and even then, I would say that it's not particularly romantic to me. It almost read as a kind of damaging relationship. It wasn't a loving kind of thing. It was almost verging on abusive in points. They certainly didn't fall into each other's arms and live happily ever after. I just didn't enjoy the themes. I didn't enjoy the overall story. As I say, I thought the romances inside the story were actually damaging and probably not what I would call a classic love story at all. I just completely missed the mark with this book, which is really sad. I did, as I say, look through the reviews because I had a feeling that I'd be in the minority with this, and everybody else, and I mean everybody else, seems to really love it. So I may try to come back to it at some point. I think I'm also going to watch the film. Let me know down below if you've read it. Have you had a better experience? How did you get past these issues that I just could not see past? And let me know down below if you've had the same experience, because it'd be quite nice to hear that somebody else has experienced it the way I have. As I say, I hold my hands up and admit that it may be because of the way I read it, because I probably did miss a lot of the characterisation by doing it that way, but as a whole that doesn't make up for the lack of romance and the quite abhorrent beliefs that are displayed within. So sadly this was not for me. Don't take my word for it and not read it because of what I said, unless you don't like racial language, because there is a lot of it and it is quite unpleasant to read at points. But yeah, as I say, don't take my word for it. A lot of people seem to love this, so I'm definitely in the minority. But yeah, so that was that. It was a bit disappointing really. I think I got to the point about 500 pages in where I realised that I probably wasn't going to enjoy it, but by the time you've read 500 pages of a book, you can't exactly put it to the side. You might as well carry on. To be fair, on the writing it was actually quite beautiful at times, and it was gripping enough that it kept me reading. I didn't ever really want to put it to the side and never come back to it. It was, you know, it kept the pace going and there was enough there to keep me reading. But overall, I just, yeah, it just wasn't for me, sadly. So yes, anyway, I'll stop ranting now and I will see you next time. Bye.